Hello, I'm David Warner, and I'm doing a little video here to cover some events and some information that's been recently uncovered, or not so recently uncovered, that hasn't received a lot of airtime. I think if you're a voter in American politics, you want to know a little bit about the background of some of the politicians and how some of them are still interacting and affecting our political process. You might want to watch this video. Now, this video was also put together with the assistance of my daughter, Savannah, and Alexa, and a lot of websites, and a couple of videos where in the video I'm attributing those that have created those videos and submitted that information. You'll see them on the video. And again, I want to thank all those that contributed to their videos and promoting this online and making this accessible so that the citizens can be better informed about the politicians. Alexa, what's that question? We want to ask Alexa a question. Hold on, Alexa. She's going to give us a definition here. So,
Alexa, what would happen if U.S. representatives are in breach of trust?
From mothership.sg. Those found guilty of criminal breach of trust may face imprisonment for life, or jail of up to 20 years and a fine.
So we're going to ask her another question, and it's very similar to the first one, but it'll probably give us a different answer. Alexa, if a U.S. representative is found in breach of trust, what...
From finelaw.com. Such representatives may be fined, or suspended or disbarred from practice.
Yeah, there's a lot of those, and there's a lot of misrepresentations of the term breach of trust. However, in most cases, it's written that politicians can be suspended or permanently removed from office. They can face jail time from 10 years to life, depending on where they go to court, and they might be found guilty. But in most cases, they're removed from office and can never hold a public office again. I wonder why that's not being pursued today with all of this breach of trust that's going on with these politicians. They tell you one thing, get their office, and never follow through with what they say they're going to do. And if you ask me, that's lying, misleading, misrepresenting, and is in breach of trust for the common trust of the American citizens. And I think we need to get a list together and start prosecuting these politicians for lying, misleading, and causing the death of U.S. soldiers and or people that serve our interests. Maybe not so willingly, but they serve honorably. And then they get trashed. You'll see when you watch this video.
You may have heard the word Benghazi a few times or a few thousand times in the past few years.
Probes about Benghazi.
The Benghazi committee.
You wouldn't have had your Benghazi situation.
Whether from Fox News and Republicans in Congress who insist it's a major scandal, or some liberals joking about it on Twitter, it all has to do with Republicans' deeper beliefs about Barack Obama's presidency and with the politics surrounding Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. But to see how Benghazi fits into all of that, you need to know exactly what happened in Benghazi in the first place. On the night of September 11th, 2012, a group of Islamist militia members attacked a U.S. diplomatic outpost in Benghazi, Libya. They killed 4 Americans, including the U.S. ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, who was visiting from Tripoli that week. The city was the center of the U.S.-backed rebellion that toppled Muammar Gaddafi the year before, and a number of armed groups had emerged in the aftermath. It was a dangerous environment. However, the U.S. had no intelligence suggesting a specific attack was imminent. At 9:42 p.m., the militiamen easily breached the gates of the compound and set fire to the building. A subsequent State Department review blamed systemic failures at the department's senior levels for the mission's poor security. Stevens had previously requested more security and not gotten it. In the chaos of the attack, U.S. security officers were separated from Stevens and Sean Smith, another State Department official. The 2 men died of smoke inhalation later that night. A team from the nearby CIA annex arrived and engaged militants before taking survivors back to the annex a mile away at 11:15. 40 minutes later, the attackers laid siege to the annex as well. The assault resumed around 5:15 a.m., with 2 more Americans, security agents Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty, killed by mortars firing on the annex. This later became a big controversy. Republicans accused Obama of withholding further military support that might have saved the day. But there were simply no military assets that could have gotten there in time. Starting around 7 a.m., the Americans were able to escape the compound and leave the country. The CIA initially blamed the attack on a mob protesting an anti-Islam movie, which had sparked protests elsewhere in the Middle East. Then UN Ambassador Susan Rice made this claim on several Sunday talk shows.
It began spontaneously in Benghazi as a reaction to what had transpired some hours earlier in Cairo.
That turned out to be mostly wrong. The attackers were members of Islamist militias, as we now know, not a random mob. Republicans accused the Obama administration of tampering with intelligence, specifically in Rice's talking points for the Sunday shows, to hide the fact that it was a terrorist attack. But later investigations showed that she'd honestly repeated CIA analysis rather than deliberately lying. Still, amidst the controversy, Rice withdrew herself from consideration to become the next Secretary of State. There have been 8 official investigations into Benghazi, mostly involving or led by congressional Republicans, and none has found any real evidence of a cover-up or wrongdoing by the administration, with the exception of the State Department's internal report blaming its own incompetence for failing to provide sufficient security. So why are Republicans still investigating? Partly out of a certainty that something was wrong, but this is also about politics. Republicans want to embarrass Obama and damage Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State at the time of the attack. House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy admitted as much on national television.
Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi special committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today? Her numbers are dropping. Why? Because she's untrustable.
And it's kind of worked. The Clinton email scandal arose from one of the Benghazi investigations, so you can bet we'll be hearing about Benghazi well into the presidential election.
Hi y'all, this is David E. Warner. I'm a disabled vet, and decided to do a show, including some work done, professional work done by Sean Ryan's show, Navy SEALs podcast, Vigilance Elite, his SRS 011 Blackwater Massacre podcast, done with Gina Keating, who did a lot of investigation in the Blackwater 4, Biden 4, called the Blackwater Massacre. And the reason I decided to do a quick little report on this was because that started around 2003, 2004, when those gentlemen, our heroes, that they threw under the bus, they being Hillary Clinton, the Biden, Obama administration. So 4 of our military heroes and the protectors of many executives and dignitaries that had businesses and agency throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, that whole region down there. They were sacrificed, or attempted to be sacrificed, by that administration for their illegal pursuit of manipulating foreign governments, backing foreign elected officials to work for their deep pockets or their interests, not the American interests, but big business interests, oil interests, their family interests, and their financial gains. Again, it's Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, the Obama administration, probably many others, but those are the main key players that are still trying to impact and affect our politics today. Those people are criminals. They were trying to sacrifice our heroes, our military personnel, for their gains and their wealth, and their manipulation of foreign affairs and foreign governments to get something that they could benefit from, which they're still benefiting from today. So I took some clips of Sean Ryan's show on Vigilance Elite. The Navy SEAL does these podcasts about high-tier professional military career people, and he brings these stories to light. The Americans, if you're an American, you should watch some of his shows. They will open your eyes to a lot of the sacrifices that are done every day that no one hears about until long past many years later. But this case is still impacting our politics today. The men that is being referred to in this show were heroes. They saved hundreds of lives. They saved active duty soldiers' lives. They rescued many people from combat and life-threatening situations. They lost many brothers, many friends, all to save lives. And to protect America's interests, I don't know now. I think it might have been some politicians' pockets they might have been saving, unbeknownst to them. With that, with Sean Ryan and Jeannie Keating presenting some information, I thought America might want to take a look at this. And before you vote, or if you need to change your vote, I don't know, check it out. Yeah, I'm David E. Warner, I'm a veteran. And I love the men that work in our uniform, and I'm just flabbergasted that this actually came to light. And we never paid these men for the sacrifices they still pay for today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Sean Ryan Show. This is episode 011, the very first episode in our brand new studio. Now let's get on with it. In SRS 011, what you are about to hear is an untold side of the most controversial gunfight in the Iraq War, also known as the Blackwater Massacre. These gentlemen have never been given the opportunity to tell their side of what happened in Nasir Square, Baghdad, Iraq that day. Please welcome Paul Slaw, Evan Liberty, Nick Slatton, and Dustin Hurt. Raven 23. Enjoy the show. All right, Gina, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come down here. I don't think anybody knows this case better than you, other than maybe the attorneys.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's nice to be able to use this knowledge again because I accumulated it over 5 years of covering the case. So rewarding because we finally got to tell the story of how this could actually happen in the United States to American citizens in the U.S. judicial system.
I think the first thing that you said to me is, I just want you to know I'm a liberal.
Yeah.
And which actually I think is great because it brings a new light to this, and it shows that regardless of what everybody sees in the media today, that there are things that Democrats and Republicans can come together on for the greater good. And you don't see that anymore anywhere in the media. And so when I get the opportunity, I want to bring that out and tell people and show people that it's possible that we can still work together. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was so obvious to me that this is one of the basic things that we all need to agree on, is that the criminal justice system needs to work for everybody. There needs to be a presumption of innocence regardless of what your job is or who you work for or who you support politically. And one of the reasons that I kept going on this case for so long and I was so passionate about it is a little selfish, which is I don't ever want this to happen to me or anybody else who I love. And I was covering, 4 red state, small town guys and their families and really getting to know them and the reason that they think the way that they do and what they expected of the justice system. And that's something that we all agree on, regardless of where we're from. So it's really important that we stand up for each other, especially in this kind of thing. It's the most basic thing that we all deserve.
You're a major reason on how these guys got pardoned. And you and the team that you put together on the podcast, you got Trump's attention, and congratulations, because it worked. How did you get involved in this whole thing?
I had this Shih Tzu named Jessica Simpson, who's one of my favorite actresses. I just think she's really cool. And she went outside one day. I mean, she never did this. She got out in the front yard of the house where I was living in Texas with my boyfriend, and she dragged a newspaper in. And she had never done this. Over the next few weeks, like, she would just every once in a while get out and drag a paper to our door. And so my boyfriend just picked it up, and he would read it. And one of the times that she dragged the paper in, it was the story of the Raven 23 guys getting sentenced in 2015. And he saw Dustin Hurd's name and he said, I wonder if this is my good friend's kid. But he lives in Maryville, Tennessee. And he said, but I think this is him. And he said, there is no way this kid did this. Obviously I'm an investigative reporter. And he said, you've got to do something about this. And I said, no way, dude. I'm a business reporter. I was totally against the Iraq War. I am not touching this. And a few months later, when we went to back to his hometown, Olney, Texas, we met Stacy Hurd, Dustin's dad, and my boyfriend pushed me, on him and said, she can help you with this. And I said, all right, give me the case file, because I've actually done a lot of reporting on criminal cases. I won some awards, investigative awards. So just give me the case transcript and I'll look at it. So I got it over Christmas and I went over it in 2016 for a few months. And I looked at it and I thought, man, there are a lot of irregularities in this case. There's things that I would have questioned, things that should have resulted in a new trial. Prosecutors had hidden some evidence or, refused or failed to turn it over when they should have. There are just some things here that really don't seem right. But I'm not a lawyer, so I wasn't sure. And about this same time, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers wrote an amicus brief supporting these guys and saying that they should never have gone to trial at all, that the case was rife with prosecutorial vindictiveness and misconduct, that the judge had made fatal errors, that there were precedents that were being made in this case that were dangerous for civil liberties. So I then thought, okay, I'm not crazy. There is something really wrong with this case. And that's when I made the decision, okay, I'm going to go and visit these guys in prison. And if they are good guys and I feel comfortable with this, then I'm going to take this and try to get some coverage for it or write something. I didn't know what I was going to do, but that's how I got involved. So they got sentenced, I think it was October of 2015. And then I heard about it, maybe it was April, I heard about it sometime in that same time frame, like days after they got sentenced, because we saw it in the paper.
You pretty much put just about everything on hold and gave damn near 6 years of your career to get these guys.
Yeah. But this was always on the back burner. I was always trying to find some way to get some publicity for this, but it wasn't clear exactly how that was going to happen because there was such animus against these guys. They were monsters, they were war criminals and all this stuff. So it seemed like a real losing battle. And in fact, I had, colleagues of mine, and in fact, my agent, when I went to him, said, don't touch this. Nobody wants to hear about this. No one's interested in this anymore. Just let it lie. It isn't going to work. And I couldn't interest anyone in it, And that was the really difficult part, was there were a lot of months when I would be talking to them either through email or they would call me from prison and we would try to figure out, what can we do? How can we get some light brought on this case? Because it's as it unfolded, there were more and more crimes that were committed against them in the course of these 3 trials that took place. I mean, the prosecution was shameless. They just kept violating their rights and nobody seemed to care.
We'll be splicing videos in of evidence throughout the interview.
Great. Most important thing to remember here is this case dragged on for 13 years. It was brought before the first judge in 2008. That's when the first indictments came out. And it was dismissed by the first judge to hear of it on January 31st of 2009. At that time, the Obama administration was very interested in getting Nouri al-Maliki to be elected as prime minister because they felt that they could work with him. But his big beef when the Blackwater guys were pardoned was, I need somebody to blame for all the violence that's going on here. And you just let these guys go, and I need a win. I need to not look soft with the Americans. So you need to bring this case back. It was 2 days after the judge threw the case out, not on a technicality, but because the prosecutors had violated their constitutional rights so thoroughly that the judge said, you can't bring this case, it's dirty. And so Hillary Clinton wrote an email to her second in command at the State Department and said, what do we got to do to bring this case back? And we know that because there were emails leaked from Hillary Clinton's email server that we found that show exactly that. So that's one document that you can link to is Hillary Clinton talking to Harold Cohen saying, what do we have to do to bring this back? At the time, the embassy in Baghdad were writing these cables to Washington, D.C. saying, oh my gosh, Iraq is going crazy. Baghdad is going crazy. They're so angry that this case was dropped. We need to do something about this. And the three main things that they were threatening to do was kick all of our troops out of the country. This is in early 2010. They wanted to kick all of the contractors out of the country who were protecting U.S. diplomats. And they were talking about nullifying some leases with ExxonMobil. All of those things are in the diplomatic cables that I gave you, and people can read them, and they can see all of the things that were coming out of Baghdad at the time. The imams were upset about it. The Iraqi Congress was upset about it. Everyone was up in arms about this and blaming these guys and saying that they were getting away with murdering Iraqi civilians. So this is, if you look at these, it's very obvious where the impetus to try these guys came from. So for the rest of that year, they went to grand juries trying to come up with a theory of how you can put these guys in prison for a combat-related incident. And that's difficult because if you're going to charge someone with manslaughter or murder, they can't be trying to defend themselves, which is what was happening. There was evidence that you can now see. We have a video that we gave you showing Army investigators looking at shell casings on top of a bus stop that show that insurgents were shooting at these guys. I think they probably described that there were probably 8 to 10 insurgents in the square. And when they returned from the incident, told the State Department investigators exactly where they were. The next day, the State Department went out and found shell casings in the places where they had designated. And the State Department said, this is a clean shoot. There is no problem with this. But because of all of these things that were happening politically, they had to go back and reinvestigate it. And, and then they came up with this ridiculous theory that they had. So they go to trial in 2014 and they are convicted. The prosecutors bring over the largest number of foreign witnesses ever in any U.S. trial to testify. There was a failure of the defense to challenge the number of victims. So you had all of these people coming to testify on the stand in Washington, D.C., and it was, I'm sure, extremely difficult for a jury to rule against these people. I mean, some of them definitely had lost loved ones and had seen horrible carnage, but it's not even really clear whether all of that occurred in Nisour Square, because there were 2 other incidents that happened that same day. So this was such a flawed investigation. It just was kind of like a show trial.
Yeah. Why did the government indict these men in 2008, but wait almost 7 years to try them in 2014?
Okay, so the first judge to hear this case was Judge Ricardo Urbina, who was a Clinton appointee. And he looked at the case and he said, no, you not only do you have some technical issues here with using their statements against them, but you don't have a case. You violated their constitutional rights multiple times. So I'm throwing this case out. You can't bring it. So then it goes to the appeals court. And as I described, the appeals court comes back and says, yeah, you can try them. So all this political stuff is happening at the same time, but it takes such a long time for them to formulate a new theory of the case, to get witnesses like Jeremy Ridgway, who was their main witness, and Matt Murphy and some of these other guys to change their stories and do plea deals, that it took that long to re-indict them and bring them back. And at the same time, the FBI and the DOJ was exerting an immense amount of pressure on them just to plead guilty and testify against each other, because they didn't want to bring this case to trial because they had no case. So that's why it took so long.
Okay. They weren't even allowed to try them, or it got extremely tricky because they had the Military Extraterritorial Judicial Act.
Right.
And so basically what that is saying is they couldn't try them in Iraq, correct? So they had to bring them home.
Yeah, it's something like that. Okay, so when they were caught in a gray zone. All of them are veterans, and had this happened while they were in their respective services, they would have, come home and been tried in the military justice system. But because they were civilian contractors, there was an order that Paul Bremer made when he was in charge of Iraq when we first invaded, that said that any civilian contractors or civilian employees of the United States had to come back to the United States to be tried. But there was a question as to whether or not they could be tried under MIJA, because that applied to defense-related contractors.
DOD contractors.
Exactly. So, but the Blackwater was working for the Department of State. They were protecting diplomats, and that was what their job was. But because it was so violent in Iraq, there was a lot of overlap with their mission. They would actually get called out to help the DOD on different combat missions. And so because of this, the DOJ wanted to try them under MIJA. Now, they argued, no, that's not right. We shouldn't have to be charged under that. We should just have civilian contractors under the State Department. But they lost that. The appellate court said that they actually were on the defense mission, even though the number 2 guy testified for the defense and said, no, I am number 2 at the Defense Department. They weren't working for us. They're State Department contractors.
What's interesting is I think it was talking to Nick offline at dinner the night before I interviewed them, and how they kind of went around that is they saved a Army convoy that got hit. They saved active duty service members' lives, and they used that against them so that they could try them under MIJA.
Yeah. Right. So no good deed goes unpunished. I mean, they did that a lot. There were several leading up to the Nisour Square incident. They were called out a lot to support the Army. So that it just makes it even more galling that they're out there doing an active duty combat mission, not just protecting diplomats, and they get hammered for that. It's so hypocritical. It's really hard to believe.
Kind of block we have here is why did this take so damn long?
No, it was 3. Don't forget, it was 3 trials. So we had the 2014 trial. All of them were convicted. And then they went to the appellate court, and the appellate court said, okay, Nick Slatton should be tried separately. And so he gets a new trial. And these other guys need to be resentenced because this gun charge that you convicted them on does not apply to them. That dragged on because the judge was waiting for Nick to be retried. They retried him one time, and the jury found hung, and they didn't get a conviction. And then they went back again and convicted him 3 months later. Then the guys were able to appeal or were resentenced. So it was so bad of the government to do this. 13 years on those families. It was absolutely a waste of resources.
Nick took a polygraph.
Yes.
The top polygrapher from FBI had recently retired and had kind of started his own private business. So they hired him to give Nick the polygraph. And it sounded like the gentleman that gave him the polygraph had convinced himself that Nick was guilty, and had kind of verbalized to Nick, I'm going to find out that you're lying. And so Nick takes the polygraph, passes the polygraph, and the guy apologized to him, saying, you didn't do this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that polygraph was kind of like the last desperate act because, first of all, there was no evidence that Nick did what he was accused of. And in fact, the government decided not to include him in the early stages of the case because they didn't have any evidence that he did anything wrong. After the case was dropped, they decided, we kind of want to put him back in. But they had let the statute of limitations on a manslaughter charges expire against him. So they couldn't file really any charges against him except murder, because that doesn't have a statute of limitations. They put him back in the case with this ridiculous theory that somehow out of the porthole of one of the vehicles that he was able to shoot someone that wasn't even in the range of his rifle. But he shot this driver of the white Kia, even though Paul Slough and every other team member on Raven 23 said Paul Slough did it. Paul Slough made 4 sworn statements. I'm the one who shot the Kia driver. Everybody said Paul Slough shot the Kia driver. The FBI told the father of the Kia driver that Paul Slough shot his son. The FBI tried to bring the father back to the United States to testify against Nick in his second and third trial. And the guy said, no, we have that email too. He told the FBI, I will not come back and testify against Nick Slatton. You told me for 7 years that it was Paul Slough that shot my son. I won't come. They had no forensic evidence. This attempt to exonerate himself and to bring some kind of sanity into these proceedings was him going to the polygrapher and saying, can you just show I'm not lying? But that failed too because they decided to prosecute him again.
Yeah. What happened? They had Ridgway, who flipped his entire story, who said all along that they had taken contact, they were receiving fire, and that it was self-defense.
Yeah.
Then Ridgway changes his story to where that they shot first. How did this happen?
I mean, this is the most difficult thing to understand. It's not like, nobody knew about this case. The national and international media were covering this case. Nothing was done in secret. Between the time that Judge Urbina threw the case out to when they brought it back and this other judge named Judge Lamberth took it over, they simply decided, okay, we're going to go to a grand jury, and instead of letting people testify, we're going to write these summaries, and the summaries are going to be whatever we say they are. We're going to take all the witness statements and we're going to edit them just to say all the stuff that we want them to say. They kept out everything that was exculpatory towards the guys. All the evidence that they were shot at was removed from these summaries that were presented to the grand jury. They were threatening witnesses. They were hiding evidence from the witnesses, like Jeremy Ridgway, ended up testifying against the guys. So those witnesses felt like, okay, I'm going to be railroaded. I might as well just fall in line here. That was the decision that Ridgway apparently made, because he didn't know. There were shell casings that were found. There were photographs that the prosecutors had. There was plenty of evidence showing that this was a gun battle and not some kind of freak out by these guys, like the prosecutors were saying. They just completely made up this theory of the case, and they shopped it to the grand jury, and they got away with it. A former prosecutor who was representing this guy named Donald Ball, who was also in the case for a while. But this lawyer said to the prosecutors, hey, you better watch out, because if you keep doing this, I'm going to report you for misconduct. Because he saw what they had presented to the grand jury, and he said every single witness that testified that there was shooting, even the Iraqi witnesses, you've removed that from what you presented to the grand jury. But by this time, they have this new judge, Judge Lamberth, Royce Lamberth, who just decides to go along with whatever these prosecutors want. He allows this case to go forward, even with these flawed indictments. When the prosecutors would come to court and they'd get caught not bringing in evidence that the defense eventually found out about, he'd just say, series of harmless errors. So the judge was also complicit in this. And it's not just me saying this. The National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers also questioned this judge and his rulings, found him violating the men's civil rights. No one in the media questioned this, which was very upsetting to me.
You brought up some interesting points in your document about this judge who
Yes.
also had something happen to him in Vietnam.
When I was trying to get people interested in this story, they would say, well, how come the judge is allowing this? And I thought, you know what, I got to figure out who this guy is. He's a career federal employee. He was a JAG in Vietnam for a year. He went in country. And there is an incident that he talks about a lot that he seems to be very proud of, which I find incredibly hypocritical. And that is that he went into a village to investigate a case in which some rangers were accused of capturing some Viet Cong guys and slitting them open and stuffing their bodies with rice. And this obviously is a war crime. They were caught talking about it in a bar. So he was charged with representing them, and he flew into the place where the bodies were supposed to be. But on the way down to the landing, the helicopter started having engine trouble. He freaked out and grabbed an automatic weapon and started firing into the jungle towards the village, just firing like crazy because he thought that they were being shot at. And they have this hard landing and he realizes, haha, nothing was happening. It was just engine trouble. So that to me was so incredibly hypocritical that he could sit on the stand and accuse these guys of freaking out and losing their cool. And, you know, they're good men, but they just lost their nerve. Well, that's what happened to you. You ought to know about that. But that isn't what happened to these men, and there's no evidence that they did this. And the other thing about that story that was so hypocritical was that he brags that he wasn't allowed, that he won that case in favor of the Rangers because they couldn't find the victims' bodies. There were no autopsies performed in this case. None. And so here you have this major case with not one single autopsy performed.
Wow.
So how are you proud of that?
Yeah.
You know, that you're putting these veterans in prison with no evidence whatsoever. Oh, did they tell you about how the FBI would chase them down in their hometowns, Nick and Dustin?
No.
Yeah. So when they were trying to get the guys to plead because they knew that they had no case, they sent agents to Nick's house, to his family farm, to try to question him. And to Dustin's house also, and just parked there and went around town and tried and followed them and tried to intimidate them.
Let's talk about the motives on why this case became so important with the SOFA agreement, with the ExxonMobil contracts coming up. So the SOFA agreement is the Status of Forces Agreement.
Yes.
And the Status of Forces Agreement was between Iraq and the U.S., which basically stated when we went over there that our troops would be out by a certain date. I think it was you'll
Obama.
start pulling troops in 2009 and the last ones will be out by December 2011.
I think that's right, yeah.
What was going on at that time when the SOFA agreement was getting ready to expire?
We talk about the election too, because that kind of feeds into it as well. At the time, if everybody remembers, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama ran in 2008 on getting out of Iraq, and they were about as anti-contractor as you could possibly imagine. I mean, they were like fighting each other for which one hated contractors more, which to me was extremely disingenuous. Later, when I found out that by the time Obama got out of office, there were 3 contractors to every soldier in Afghanistan and 2 contractors to every soldier in Iraq. We could not have prosecuted the war without contractors. And the contractors were exactly the same people in most cases as the troops. To put this blame on contractors, I found really pretty repugnant. So what was happening in January of 2010 with Judge Urbina dismissing the case was 2 things. Number one, Nouri al-Maliki was about to stand for election in March of 2010. And he was not, according to the polls, going to win. But he was the person who we backed because we felt like we'd put him in when we invaded Iraq and we could deal with him. We felt like he was somebody that we could negotiate with. He was a known quantity. Surprisingly, Iran's Soleimani also backed him, which is kind of ironic if you think about it. So when the Blackwater case was dismissed and everything started going crazy in Baghdad, the Iraqi government threatened to not approve the SOFA agreement, which would let our forces stay in Iraq and stabilize it. And we had some massive things going on that needed to keep on going, which was we needed to withdraw in an orderly fashion and we needed to keep everything kind of calm for the oil companies that were trying to get their leases.
They didn't want the SOFA agreement to expire because we would have had to pull troops out.
Right.
If we pull troops out, that destabilizes the entire country, which makes for a complicated election cycle.
Right.
So Obama and Biden needed that agreement signed so that we could keep troops in country so that they would have a smooth election.
Yes.
Iraqi prime minister did not want to keep the troops there because he wanted these Blackwater guys prosecuted. So he told them, I'm not signing it. Pull your troops out. We re-indicted.
Well, first Joe Biden ran over to Iraq and stood up with Iraqi government officials in front of the cameras and said, hey, we're really sorry this happened. We're really disappointed at this outcome. We don't think that it's right. And we promise we're going to get justice for the Iraqi people. Okay, so what you're, a defendant and the second most powerful man in your country says, hey, you're guilty. I mean, he did it essentially because the Iraqis needed Nouri al-Maliki needed to look tough, and that's also in those diplomatic cables in front of the Americans, or he was threatening not to approve the SOFA or allow contractors to stay in the country.
And then when they did re-indict, the SOFA agreement was signed how fast afterwards? When I talked to Bill Cofield, Evan's attorney, he said that the SOFA agreement was signed the very next week.
Yeah, I'm sure that's probably true. There was no hiccup with the SOFA agreement. So that tells you.
Yeah.
Mentioned in one of the very first cables. And when I looked at those, Paul Slough's lawyer is the one who found those, and he gave them to me. And I called Robert Ford, who was the charge d'affaires at the time in Iraq, in Baghdad. And I called him up and went over all these cables with him. I sent them to him and said, hey, do you remember sending these? And he goes, well, I didn't write them, but I absolutely remember sending them. And I said, well, explain this to me. Explain what was going on here. He kind of glossed over that part of it, but he said, what happened here was not their fault. They did exactly what we told them to do. Everything that they did in Nisr Square was in their contract. They followed the contract. So I can't really speak anymore to the ExxonMobil part, but the fact that he included it as the third paragraph of all the fallout of the dismissal of that case says a lot.
Yeah. Were there any other political reasons on why they wanted these guys down in prison?
The other thing that was difficult for them was Eric Prince was not popular during the Obama White House years. He's Christian, conservative, rich. They just, they didn't like him. They didn't like that he was making a lot of money on the war, but it wasn't his fault. Reinstitute the draft if you're so upset about contractors, but nobody had the political courage to do that. So it was really convenient to get mad at Eric Prince for being successful at something, which was training veterans and equipping them properly, as we should have done when we sent people over to Iraq. So everything having to do with this case was reflected in the Blackwater logo. That is something they could not escape. They could not escape the association with Blackwater. And I think that that's why it was so easy to convict them in Washington, D.C. I think that if they had actually tried them where they should have tried them, which was in Salt Lake City or Tennessee or Texas, where they were from, there's no way that they would have got this result. But Eric Prince was such a bête noire in Washington, D.C., that they were never going to get a fair trial because of him.
Did he jump in and help at all?
I think that probably, he used whatever influence that he had to try to get them freed. I talked to him for my podcast, and he did give me an interview. But I think that he was well aware that any kind of association with him was negative for them. And I had an expert who actually defends a lot of these cases and is a former federal prosecutor and a former JAG. And I said, how much do you think this case cost the government? And he said, $50 million easy. 3 trials, 13 years. They brought probably 45 people over from Iraq and put them up. They went to Iraq and back, stored cars that were supposedly in Nisr Square. I mean, collected evidence. Think about that. Think about how expensive that is.
All for an Iraqi election. Let's talk about the bodies.
Okay.
How many bodies were found?
They were actually convicted for killing 2 people whose bodies never showed up, whose bodies were never found. They were basically people whose relatives said that they were in Nisr Square around that time, that same day, but they never came home.
They never found any bodies, and they were accused of, killing 17 and wounding 20?
When I first started looking at this case, I went back to all of the contemporaneous news stories that were filed from Baghdad that day. And I also looked at the Iraqi government statement about the incident, okay? And don't forget, there were 3 major incidents that day involving contractors and American soldiers, right? Shootouts, okay? So when I looked
within just a few miles of each other. We're not even talking all of Baghdad.
Exactly.
We're talking, you could hear.
Right, exactly.
They were so close.
So when I looked at this, the New York Times reporter who was there in Baghdad reported on that day that 8 people were taken to the hospital. 8, okay? In all of Baghdad that day. The Iraqi government put out a statement that said something like less than 10 people were killed in that incident. The American government is running ads on Iraqi TV asking anybody who might have had something to do with the Nisr Square shooting to please come forward. And all of a sudden you get this enormous number of dead and wounded, some of whom, as I mentioned, were never found. The bodies were never found.
What was in those ads? Was there a reward or compensation?
It was a phone number and just a call for, anybody to come forward. But by this time, it was very well known that the U.S. Embassy was paying people cash for being involved in shootings with American personnel. And in the State Department cables, you'll see that the standard payment was $10,000 for a dead family member, $5,000 for wounded, and $2,500 for property damage. This was well known by the time the Nisr Square incident happened. This is something I discussed with Robert Ford. Everybody knew this. Whenever there was a big incident, People would just show up at the embassy and say, hey, I had somebody killed.
I spent 14 in and out of Middle Eastern countries and war zones for 14 years. And every time I would go to the embassy, there was always a line of locals trying to get some kind of compensation for a dead goat or a shot car or a dead family member. And there's never seems to be any proof.
You can't blame these people. I mean, their society was completely upended by this war. I do everything I could to get money as well. But, when you're prosecuting people and taking away their liberty and, putting their family through this hell, you want to have actual bodies. You want to have actual crimes. One thing I wanted to read to you, because when I was preparing for this, I wanted to say this because I think that people don't know it. One thing that was really disturbing to me about the way this case was presented to the Washington, D.C. juries was the prosecutors acted like, that these guys drove into Times Square and just started shooting people. Like it was that kind of atmosphere where it's just a normal day in Baghdad and no one was shooting and no one was dying. But in fact, this was at the height of the killings in Baghdad. There's a very reliable website that I used a lot just to try to get some kind of perspective on how many casualties were occurring in Baghdad at this time in 2007, September, right? And you'll remember that this is the time of the surge. And there was a lot of fighting that was going on in opposition to this. So according to Iraqi body count, the first 8 months of 2007 saw the most massive vehicle bomb-based attacks in Iraq's history. They occurred with greater frequency than at any time during the war. That's right when this was happening. There were 20 bomb attacks killing 50 people. In one case, 500 civilians were killed. So the U.S. government was going around to the media and saying, this is the worst massacre in Iraq history. And if you go on Wikipedia, you're going to see that. It's the worst massacre in Iraq history. That is complete bullshit. It is a total lie. There were somewhere between 868 to 1,326 deaths of civilian bystanders by U.S.-led coalition forces in 2007. And that includes 88 children. Okay, so to say that this was the worst massacre in Iraq, in the history of the Iraq War, is a total lie. And it shocks me that this continues to be perpetrated in the media. It shocks me when these guys are free and the United Nations makes a statement that this is the worst massacre. The worst massacre in the entire war. Yeah, right.
At that time was, what years were they putting that out? Up to 2007, right. So 4 years. I think we went in 2003. Yeah.
They recovered no bodies because the bodies were removed from the scene immediately. But of the body count for the Nisour Square incident, they counted 2 people where they don't even know what happened to them because they had no bodies. They don't have death certificates or anything else. They allowed them to be prosecuted for 2 people who just disappeared that day.
The 2, did they remove the bodies from the Kia?
No, those were still, they were still at the scene, and they were the only 2 bodies that were still at the scene.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Yeah. Is the only recovered 2 bodies.
Exactly.
And that was a justified shoot.
Exactly.
So, interesting.
Again, this is David Newarn, and again, with the help of my daughter and a lot of information all over the websites, I thought I'd throw some information out there for people. I think you'll see more videos from me in the near future. I think maybe I'll become a vocal advocate of some things I see or some things I disagree with. I don't know. I'm just tired of seeing news on a variety of various channels promoting misinformation, disinformation, or slanted information for one political party or another. I'm tired of seeing a world at war in the United States between Republicans and Democrats, and that's what it is. They fight each other to make the stories look really important, and it's all got to do with misrepresentation, fraud, making somebody look bad or somebody sound stupid, whatever. And they're making money from all these lobbyists. We need term limits, really. We got to cut this stuff out. I mean, if they want to run again, have them get voted in office again. Stop this concurrent running for office, running. Politicians in office, representatives, senators, they spend years and decades in office, and they're getting all this PAC money and lobbyist money. It's just ruining our country. We need to seriously crack down on these politicians. And why do politicians all have to be lawyers and learn how to lie and misrepresent the word? And it's crazy how they manipulate things. So I'm tired of that. And so here's some events that impacted lives of American soldiers, people representing honor and trying to save each other's lives and save hundreds of lives. And the State Department and the political parties throw them under the bus. There's no other reason behind what happened to them other than they were sacrificed to put a foreign politician in office who wouldn't have been able to benefit the United States for several years later. Even if the Iraqis like that guy, I'm sorry. We should not be manipulating foreign governments like that. That's not our business. It may be a way to manipulate those governments to support America, but our interest should be at home. We are dying across the United Nations from new diseases due to immigration, the lack of control, people bringing in measles, mumps, rubella, all those other diseases. You know, we have a lot of concerns. Our infrastructure is decaying and rotting all across the nation. Cities are dying. People are leaving their individual counties, their individual cities, their towns are dying because our infrastructure is so bad. They can't live in different regions of the United States anymore. And we have millions of acres that could be used to benefit our country. But there's no financial support because it's going to foreign countries out there that we have no interest in other than to sell bullets in artillery rounds and make big bucks off of war. We should not be doing that. We should make big bucks selling medical supplies and medical aid to foreign countries, not sending bullets to foreign countries. We need to be beneficiaries. We don't need to be protagonists. That's not what we were designed for, not what America developed itself for. What we established America for was for the betterment, the better life of the people of America, and to help our friends and allies across the world, not get into politics that creates more war. From a veteran who's seen a lot of death and stress, we don't need that crap anymore. We need to know how to do it. We need to know how to end it. But we don't need to be out there starting it. So please review this video, send it to your friends, get the politicians to work for the right things in life, not the money, and not for big business. And a note on big business. If a big business can get tax write-offs where citizens don't, there's something wrong with that. If a big business can be treated legally as an individual, it can be taxed as an individual. Anyway, please review the video. I hope you have been enlightened a little bit about some things. I hope that maybe if you do your own investigations, maybe you can find some more information on these subjects that were addressed in this video. Spread the word. Get people out there to be more awakened to what's going on. Anyway, David E. Warner, thank you.
Trust indentures and breach of trust. Learning more about our constitutions and the potential legal ramification for public officers. A quick review. A trust is any arrangement where property is transferred with intention that it be administered by a trustee for another's benefit. The trustees have legal obligations to administer the duties conformable to the principles of justice and right. I've done a different video called Constitutions or Trust Agreements, and I encourage you to go look at that video to get more specific details. Who are the trustees? Trustees are our public officers, all officers of government. In the Georgia Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 1, it states, all government of right originates with the people, is founded upon their will only, and is instituted solely for the good of the whole. Public officers are the trustees and servants of the people and are at all times amenable to them. Amenable means subject to answer to law, accountable, liable to punishment. That's from Black's Law, 5th edition. And the Georgia Constitution, this is from their Bill of Rights, and this applies to all people in all states. What is an express trust? It is a trust created or declared in express terms, and usually in writing, as distinguished from one inferred by the law from the conduct or dealings of the parties. The federal Constitution and each of the 50 state constitutions are expressed trust agreements, as they are documents with expressly written instructions directing government officials. Express means clear, definite, directly and distinctly stated, and that's from Black's Law, 5th edition. What is a trust indenture? Trust indenture means the document which contains the terms and conditions which govern the conduct of the trustee and the rights of the beneficiaries. The federal Constitution and each of the 50 state constitutions are trust indentures. As you look at Constitution, you will see that it contains a section referred to as the Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights. These are the rights of the beneficiaries, us, we the people. The other portion of the Constitution is called the Frame of Government, which contains the written instructions which govern the trustees. The trust indentures contain certain things. It must be a written document. It has express terms. It will list the rights of the beneficiaries, which are called the Bill or Declaration of Rights. And it must contain terms which govern the role of the trustees. And that section is called the Frame of Government. So those 4 items are contained in our constitutions, which show they are trust indentures. The Bill of Rights apply to all Americans. The Frame of Government portion applies to our particular state within each of the state constitutions. Upon being elected, now you know that our constitutions are legal documents known as trust indentures. When someone is elected into office, they become a trustee bound by a trust indenture for their particular state and the United States. This position comes with a legal duties and responsibilities that by law must be followed. A trustee's duty is to act in the best interest of the trust and its beneficiaries, we the people, not in the interest of the public servant or lobbyist. Their main objective is to protect the rights and property of we the people. What constitutes a breach of trust? Breach of trust means any act done by a trustee contrary to the terms of his trust or in excess of his authority and to the detriment of the trust. The wrongful omission by a trustee of any act required of him by the terms of the trust. The wrongful misappropriation by a trustee of any fund or property which had been lawfully committed to him in a fiduciary character. Every violation by a trustee of a duty which equity lays upon him, whether willful and fraudulent, or done through negligence, or arising through mere oversight and forgetfulness, is a breach of trust. Equity means the spirit and the habit of fairness, justness, and right dealing. And these definitions come from Black's Law, 4th edition. Here are the various categories and examples for each category. Any act contrary to terms of trust, violating instructions as written in the constitutions, violating rights of liberty, free speech, right to protect yourself with arms, omission of any act required of him, not performing duties according to the Constitution and statutes which bind government officials, such as election laws, following election form and written protocols for elections, in excess of authority, mandating vaccines, shutting down businesses, requiring masks, putting people in jail without due process of law, as in the January 6 prisoners. And this could also fall under the omission of any act required of him. Wrongful misappropriation of funds or property, using funds to get agencies to go against the rights of the people, leaving behind our expensive military equipment in a foreign country. Constitution and statutes. The Constitution has expressly written directives for public officials to follow by law. Each of the states and the United States are corporations by design. The statutes created by the legislatures are corporate bylaws which govern the internal operations of government. The trustees are required by law to follow these directives, such as election laws, rules, and codes on how government business should be conducted for the benefit and protection of the people. When the laws, rules, and codes are not upheld by trustees according to the letter of the law, a breach of trust occurs. Consequences for a breach of trust can include fines, removal from a trustee position, and jail time. Summation. Government officials are trustees bound by trust indentures known as constitutions. Trust indentures are legally binding, expressly written directives for the trustees, government officials, which also contains the expressed rights of the beneficiaries, we the people. Any act done contrary to the terms of the agreement or in excess of their granted authority, or any act required which was omitted, or any misappropriation of funds is a breach of trust, which can lead to fines, removal of position, and jail time depending on the circumstances. Alexander Hamilton stated, "If it be asked, what is the most sacred duty and the greatest source of our security in a republic, the answer would be an inviolable respect for the Constitution and laws." And inviolable means not to be profaned or treated with irreverence. That's from Noah Webster, 1828. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something new. Please share this with others.